Well, I'm really grateful that you're all here. You know, history is biography, so we're the ones who can change the course of the history of the United States, which needs alteration if we're to prevent the ruination that's afflicted all other empires. And to give you a little bit of background of who I am and where I came from, I was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the first verses I learned as a young child was the Midnight Rite of Paul Revere. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight rite of Paul Revere, the 17th of April in 75, and barely a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. Early on, I went out to Old North Bridge and recited Concord hymn by Ralph Waldo Emerson. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flags to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled fathers stood, and farmers stood, and fired the shot hurled round the world. And so my life has been involved in understanding the theory, the philosophy of the Founding Fathers that enabled 13 small states to grow into a very strong and admirable democracy for many, many years before it began to succumb to the temptations of empire that the Founding Fathers warned us against. And what I'd like to do in this opportunity, in this occasion, is to explain the philosophical birth certificate of the United States, built upon 4 founding documents. And one of the things we need to remember about the Founding Fathers is they were not elitists, but they were exceptionally erudite, not for the sake of pedantry, but they understood that all of the world was built upon understanding human nature. You needed to know what were the motivations that drove people with power, what were the motivations that would drive a commoner, whether it was avarice, whether it was desire for fame, whether it was desire for authority over others. And they repeatedly referred to making proper deductions for the ordinary depravity of human nature when they were crafting their institutions and etching into the Constitution particular powers and authorities and rights. And that's one of the things that was so exceptional about the Founding Fathers. They knew that they weren't made of DNA that had escaped other peoples, and that they had to recognize that they needed to build in these kinds of checks, doubt of their own virtue, despite the fact that they were probably amongst all other generations filled with people of greatness of character, George Washington amongst others. They still know we cannot rely upon institutions that need these virtuous saints in office, otherwise everything would collapse because you cannot inherit saintliness. Let me explain then the 4 founding documents and where that philosophy began and how we've run awry. The beginning is the Declaration of Independence, and its most important recognition was that the purpose of government, indeed the sole purpose of government, was to secure rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Now that's critical. It means government has no legitimate objective to create bigger government, to change other peoples. Freedom and liberty is the rule. If there's an exception, the burden of proof is on the government to justify the exception. So when we hear these claims, well, unless we give the government authority to do X, Y, Z, maybe something bad will happen, we'll have another 9/11, maybe we won't catch somebody or whatever. That's not good enough. The Founding Fathers said, we're willing to take risks in the name of freedom and liberty. We'd rather be free than safe but vassals. And that is one of the elements that we've lost here today. We'll become big government if they will give us security, they'll promise us a job, they'll promise Social Security, they'll go abroad in every crevice of the universe and trying to create safety for us by concocting fears that are very ephemeral or transient. And I bring that up because in the current debate over the Patriot Act, that's a critical provision. Well, we need to give the FBI these national security letter authorities. We don't have to have warrants anymore. That's what we fought for to establish the Fourth Amendment, because after all, what might happen if we don't catch an Al-Qaeda because we didn't connect the dots by invading someone's privacy? But there's no proof that that ever has been the case, that the warrants weren't sufficient beforehand. Doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes. But the understanding that the philosophy is freedom is the rule, it's the default position, you have a high hurdle for the government, explains, and why we've lost that explains much of the overreach of the government, not only post 9/11, but previously. Let's go to the second charter document, the Constitution of the United States. And there are 2 phrases there that bespeak the underlying philosophy of what government was about. The first is that in the preamble it states that the major overriding purpose of this endeavor is to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Remember, ourselves and our posterity. Doesn't say anything about those suffering under the Romanovs, under the Chinese Empire, under the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. There were those neighbors in Latin and Central America were suffering under Portuguese and Spanish empires. Not a syllable that the goal and mission of the United States was to liberate them, ourselves and our posterity. And they understood, indeed Madison warned, that we would destroy our republic if we became involved in perpetual warfare. Warfare is inconsistent with liberty. All power goes to the executive, and as Cicero said, and was true thousands of years after he said it, in times of war, the law is silent. Even if it may be there ostensibly, in application, it is silent. The second phrase in the Declaration of, in the Constitution that was so critical was the first three words, we the people. We the people, a revolutionary concept of where sovereignty was. All previous dispensations viewed an omnipotent authority from a religious figure, from a secular king, a monarch, or whatever, and the people could grasp rights like Magna Carta out from an omnipotent authority. The Constitution and the American people were different. We are sovereign. Only those in government are stewards. They're custodians. They have no sovereignty that we haven't yielded. And that's critical because it underscores, again, the idea that the government has nothing unless we give it. And the government must explain with great convincing reasons and evidence why they should have any authority at all to take our property, to tax, to regulate, unless there's an overriding social interest that can't be accommodated through private action and liberty. Then we come to George Washington's farewell address. That's the third major philosophical doctrine, where he promotes the idea, no entangling alliances. He understood, like Lord Palmerston later on, countries don't have friends or enemies, they have interests. Our interests are not the same as other interests. And despite the fact that APAC may have you think differently, our interests aren't the same as Israel's. It's not. Not the same as any other country. It's not the same as Great Britain's, not the same as France's, or Egypt's, or anybody else's. We're here to defend our interests, and we shouldn't expect others to obey what we tell them that their interests, just like we wouldn't to obey them if they tell us. If we tell Mubarak to go, I'm sure he's going to say, well, sorry, you don't direct me. Or we tell Pakistan, you need to reform, and you should be less worried about India than Afghanistan. They'll say, well, you'll let us alone. And that kind of arrogance creates enemies. Because who likes to be told what's good for them? You probably raise kids, and when you tell your child, yeah, this is going to be good for you, they say, well, let me decide that on my own. Human nature is the same. Countries feel the same way. And that was the understanding of George Washington. And remember, it wasn't just words, they acted upon it. Shortly after he gave his farewell address, what happened in Latin and Central America? He had these eruptions beginning in 1810 against the Spanish and Portuguese colonizing. And what did the United States do? We didn't intervene. We watched. We would like to be influential by example. And indeed, our Constitution was used as the foundation for many other constitutions in states that emerged out of these revolutions in Central or South America. But otherwise, we didn't do anything. We didn't even recognize the new governments until Spain and Portugal recognized them. No one said, well, this is a calamity. We'll be endangered unless every country in Central and South America turns into a carbon copy of the United States. No, we build our defenses. We didn't intervene. We didn't generate any enmities for that intervention. And then the fourth great founding document, John Quincy Adams, 1821, July 4th address to Congress. Perhaps the greatest exposition, I think, of what this country was about and lived during the first 75 years. And what he stated was that the great earmark of the United States that brightened the entire world was the understanding that we didn't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. That we preserved and fought for freedom for ourselves. We would like to be influential by the force of example, but if we became dictatress of the world, which we could, we would destroy all of our Republican virtues. Because in the process of exerting military power, it destroys all of the values of liberty, due process, and a focus on the individual as the center of the constitutional universe, not some amorphous state that somehow are supposed to be prideful because it can march around the world like Julius Caesar, Veni, Vidi, Vici. Founding fathers didn't want to do that. It really captures what Abraham Lincoln described for him personally. He said, as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. As we would not want to be colonized, we don't want to be a colonizer. We enjoy being followed by example, but otherwise, that's not our business. And part of it is because we create more enemies by exerting ourselves abroad. If you think of the spending we did in Egypt to have those tanks there in Cairo, the tear gas, made in America, what's being used. You don't think the Egyptians understand that? They certainly do. And we have come to this false assumption that defense is to be measured by inputs. You just spend more, then we must be safer. We now have a military budget, if you include intelligence spending and the Department of Energy that houses the nuclear weapons, of about $1 trillion a year. It's about $1 trillion a year. That's half of all global spending on defense. Half, if we add every other country in the world, it about equals ours. And this idea, well, the more you spend something, the greater safety you have. But indeed, oftentimes it's the opposite. Because it's the projection. Instead of asking, well, what's the output? How much safer are you making us? Isn't much of that spending making us less safe? Because we're creating enemies and we're corrupting regimes when giving military equipment and money. And we know that corrupts them because they steal it. You know? Karzai is a perfect example. He wants the money to go through them. And when we give money, it really makes it less likely that foreign countries will end up democratically, because we will attract those who are come to power for one reason: avarice. That's not a high qualification for being a nationalist, someone who's going to serve the people or have anything like a stable dispensation.